Hello and welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. My name is Jay and this is a web of classic tales. If you're enjoying the videos, please like, subscribe, share, and comment. If you want notifications every single time a new video is uploaded, please click on the little bell icon. Today we will continue reading Charles Dickens' The Haunted Man and the Ghost's Bargain. A small man sat in a small parlour, partitioned off from a small shop by a small screen, pasted all over with small scraps of newspaper. In company with the small man was almost any amount of small children you may please to name. At least it seemed so. They made, in that very limited sphere of action, such an imposing effect in point of numbers. Of these small fry, 2 had, by some strong machinery, been got into bed in a corner, where they might have reposed snugly enough in the sleep of innocence, but for a constitutional propensity to keep awake, and also to scuffle in and out of bed. The immediate occasion of these predatory dashes at the waking world was the construction of an oyster-shell wall in a corner, by 2 other youths of tender age, on which fortification the 2 in bed made harassing descents, like those accursed Picts and Scots who beleaguered the early historical studies of most young Britons, and then withdrew to their own territory. In addition to the stir attendant on these inroads, and the retorts of the invaded who pursued hotly and made lunges at the bedclothes under which the marauders took refuge, another little boy, in another little bed, contributed his mite of confusion to the family stock, by casting his boots upon the waters. In other words, by launching these and several small objects, inoffensive in themselves, though of a hard substance considered as missiles, at the disturbers of his repose, who were not slow to return these compliments. Besides which, another little boy, the biggest there, but still little, was tottering to and fro, bent on one side, and considerably affected in his knees by the weight of a large baby, which he was supposed, by a fiction that obtains sometimes in sanguine families, to be hushing to sleep. But oh, the inexhaustible regions of contemplation and watchfulness into which this baby's eyes were then only beginning to compose themselves to stare over his unconscious shoulder. It was a very Moloch of a baby, on whose insatiate altar the whole existence of this particular young brother was offered up a daily sacrifice. Its personality may be said to have consisted in its never being quiet in any one place for 5 consecutive minutes, and never going to sleep when required. Tetterbies' baby was as well known in the neighbourhood as the postman or the pot-boy. It roved from doorstep to doorstep in the arms of little Johnny Tetterby, and lagged heavily at the rear of troops of juveniles who followed the tumblers or the monkeys, and came up, all on one side, a little too late for everything that was attractive, from Monday morning until Sunday night. Wherever childhood congregated to play, there was little Moloch making Johnny fag and toil. Wherever Johnny desired to stay, little Moloch became fractious, and would not remain. Whenever Johnny wanted to go out, Moloch was asleep, and must be watched. Whenever Johnny wanted to stay at home, Moloch was awake, and must be taken out. Yet Johnny was verily persuaded that it was a faultless baby, without its peer in the realm of England, and was quite content to catch meek glimpses of things in general from behind its skirts, or over its limp flapping bonnet, and to go staggering about with it like a very little porter with a very large parcel, which was not directed to anybody and could never be delivered anywhere. The small man who sat in the small parlour, making fruitless attempts to read his newspaper peaceably in the midst of this disturbance, was the father of the family, and the chief of the firm described in the inscription over the little shop front, by the name and title of A. Tetterby and Co., newsman. Indeed, strictly speaking, he was the only personage answering to that designation, as Co. was a mere poetical abstraction, altogether baseless and impersonal. Tetterby was the corner shop in the Jerusalem buildings. There was a good show of literature in the window, chiefly consisting of picture newspapers out of date, and serial pirates and footpads. Walking sticks likewise and marbles were included in the stock and trade. It had once extended into the light confectionery line, but it would seem that those elegancies of life were not in demand about Jerusalem buildings, for nothing connected with that branch of commerce remained in the window, except a sort of small glass lantern containing a languishing mass of bull's eyes, which had melted in the summer and congealed in the winter until all hope of ever getting them out, or of eating them without eating the lantern too, was gone forever. Tetterby's had tried its hand at several things. It had once made a feeble little dart at the toy business, for in another lantern there was a heap of minute wax dolls, all sticking together upside down in the direst confusion, with their feet on one another's heads, and a precipice of broken arms and legs at the bottom. It had made a move in the millinery direction, which a few dry, wiry bonnet shapes remained in a corner of the window to attest. It had fancied that a living might lie down in the tobacco trade, and had stuck up a representation of a native of each of the 3 integral portions of the British Empire in the act of consuming that fragrant weed, with a poetic legend attached, importing that united in one cause they sat and joked. One chewed tobacco, one took snuff, one smoked, but nothing seemed to have come of it, except flies. Time had been when it had put a forlorn trust in imitative jewellery, for in one pane of glass there was a card of cheap seals, and another of pencil cases, and a mysterious black amulet of inscrutable intention labelled 9 pence. But to that hour, Jerusalem Buildings had bought none of them. In short, Tetterbies had tried so hard to get a livelihood out of Jerusalem Buildings in one way or other, and appeared to have done so indifferently in all, that the best position in the firm was too evidently Co.'s. Co. as a bodiless creation, being untroubled with the vulgar conveniences of hunger and thirst, being chargeable neither to the poor's rates nor the assessed taxes, and having no young family to provide for. Tetterby himself, however, in his little parlour, as already mentioned, having the presence of a young family impressed upon his mind in a manner too clamorous to be disregarded, or to comport with the quiet perusal of a newspaper, laid down his paper, wheeled, in his distraction, a few times round the parlour, like an undecided carrier pigeon, made an ineffectual rush at 1 or 2 flying little figures in bedgowns that skimmed past him, and then, bearing suddenly down upon the only unoffending member of the family, boxed the ears of little Moloch's nurse. "You bad boy," said Mr. Tetterby. "Haven't you any feelings for your poor father after the fatigues and anxieties of a hard winter's day, since 5 o'clock in the morning? But must you wither his rest and corrode his latest intelligence with your wicious tricks? Isn't it enough, sir, that your brother Dolphus is toiling and moiling in the fog and cold, and you rolling in the lap of luxury with a baby, and everything you can wish for?" said Mr. Tetterby, heaping this up as a great climax of blessings. "But must you make a wilderness of home, and maniacs of your parents? Must you, Johnny, hey?" At each interrogation Mr. Tetterby made a feint of boxing his ears again, but thought better of it and held his hand. "Oh, father," whimpered Johnny, "when I wasn't doing anything, I'm sure, but taking such care of Sally and getting her to sleep. Oh, father!" "I wish my little woman would come home," said Mr. Tetterby, relenting and repenting. "I only wish my little woman would come home. I ain't fit to deal with them. They make my head go round and get the better of me. Oh, Johnny, isn't it enough that your dear mother has provided you with that sweet sister?" indicating Moloch. "Isn't it enough that you were 7 boys before, without a ray of gal, and that your dear mother went through what she did go through, on purpose that you might all of you have a little sister? But must you so behave yourself as to make my head swim?" Softening more and more as his own tender feelings and those of his injured son were worked on, Mr. Tetterby concluded by embracing him, and immediately breaking away to catch one of the real delinquents. A reasonably good start occurring, he succeeded, after a short but smart run, and some rather severe cross-country work under and over the bedsteads, and in and out among the intricacies of the chairs, in capturing his infant, whom he condignly punished and bore to bed. This example had a powerful, and apparently mesmeric influence on him of the boots, who instantly fell into a deep sleep, though he had been, but a moment before, broad awake, and in the highest possible feather. Nor was it lost upon the 2 young architects, who retired to bed in an adjoining closet with great privacy and speed. The comrade of the intercepted one also shrinking into his nest with similar discretion. Mr. Tetterby, when he paused for breath, found himself unexpectedly in a scene of peace. "My little woman herself," said Mr. Tetterby, wiping his flushed face, "could hardly have done it better. I only wish my little woman had it to do. I do indeed." Mr. Tetterby sought upon his screen for a passage appropriate to be impressed upon his children's minds on the occasion, and read the following. "It is an undoubted fact that all remarkable men have had remarkable mothers, and have respected them in after life as their best friends. Think of your own remarkable mother, my boys," said Mr. Tetterby, "and know her value while she is still among you." He sat down in his chair by the fire and composed himself cross-legged over his newspaper. "Let anybody, I don't care who it is, get out of bed again," said Tetterby, as a general proclamation delivered in a very soft-hearted manner, "and astonishment will be the portion of that respected contemporary," which expression Mr. Tetterby selected from his screen. "Johnny, my child, take care of your only sister Sally, for she is the brightest gem that ever sparkled on your early brow." Johnny sat down on a little stool and devotedly crushed himself beneath the weight of Moloch. "Ah, what a gift that baby is to you, Johnny," said his father, "and how thankful you ought to be. It is not generally known, Johnny. He was now referring to the screen again. But it is a fact ascertained by accurate calculations that the following immense percentage of babies never attain to 2 years old. That is to say, "Oh, don't, father, please," cried Johnny. "I can't bear it when I think of Sally." Mr. Tetterby desisting, Johnny, with a profound sense of his trust, wiped his eyes and hushed his sister. "Your brother Adolphus," said his father, poking the fire, "is late tonight, Johnny, and will come home like a lump of ice. What's got your precious mother?" "Here's mother, and Adolphus too, father," exclaimed Johnny, "I think." "You're right," returned his father, listening. "Yes, that's the footsteps of my little woman." The process of induction by which Mr. Tetterby had come to the conclusion that his wife was a little woman was his own secret. She would have made 2 editions of himself very easily. Considered as an individual, she was rather remarkable for being robust and portly, but considering with reference to her husband, her dimensions became magnificent. Nor did they assume a less imposing proportion when studied with reference to the size of her 7 sons, who were but diminutive. In the case of Sally, however, Mrs. Tetterby had asserted herself at last, as nobody knew better than the victim Johnny, who weighed and measured that exacting idol every hour in the day. Mrs. Tetterby, who had been marketing and carried a basket, threw back her bonnet and shawl, and sitting down fatigued, commanded Johnny to bring his sweet charge to her straight away for a kiss. Johnny, having complied and gone back to his stool and again crushed himself, Master Adolphus Tetterby, who had by this time unwound his torso out of a prismatic comforter, apparently interminable, requested the same favour. Johnny, having again complied and again gone back to his stool and again crushed himself, Mr. Tetterby, struck by a sudden thought, preferred the same claim on his own parental part. The satisfaction of this third desire completely exhausted the sacrifice, who had hardly breath enough left to get back to his stool, crushed himself again, and panned at his relations. "Whatever you do, Johnny," said Mrs. Tetterby, shaking her head, "take care of her, or never look your mother in the face again." "Nor your brother," said Adolphus. "Nor your father, Johnny," added Mr. Tetterby. Johnny, much affected by this conditional renunciation of him, looked down at Moloch's eyes to see that they were all right, so far, and skilfully patted her back, which was uppermost, and rocked her with his foot. "Are you wet, Adolphus, my boy?" said his father. "Come and take my chair and dry yourself." "No, father, thank ye," said Adolphus, smoothing himself down with his hands. "I ain't very wet, I don't think. Does my face shine much, father?" "Well, it does look waxy, my boy," returned Mr. Tetterby. "It's the weather, father," said Adolphus, polishing his cheeks on the worn sleeve of his jacket. "What with rain and sleet and wind and snow and fog, my face gets quite brought out into a rash sometimes, and shines, it does." "Oh, don't it though?" Master Adolphus was also in the newspaper line of life, being employed by a more thriving firm than his father and co. to vend newspapers at a railway station, where his chubby little person, like a shabbily disguised Cupid, and his shrill little voice, he was not much more than 10 years old, were as well known as the hoarse panting of the locomotives, running in and out. His juvenility might have been at some loss for a harmless outlet in this early application to traffic, but for a fortunate discovery he made of a means of entertaining himself, and of dividing the long days into stages of interest, without neglecting business. This ingenious invention, remarkable like many great discoveries for its simplicity, consisted in varying the first vowel in the word paper, and substituting in its stead, at different periods of the day, all the other vowels in grammatical succession. Thus, before daylight in the winter time, he went to and fro in his little oilskin cap and cape, and his big comforter, piercing the heavy air with his cry of "Morning paper," which about an hour before noon changed to "Morning pepper," which at about 2 changed to "Morning pipper," which in a couple of hours changed to "Morning popper," and so declined with the sun into "Evening pupper," to the great relief and comfort of his young gentleman's spirits. Mrs. Tetterby, his lady mother, who had been sitting with her bonnet and shawl thrown back, as aforesaid, thoughtfully turning her wedding ring round and round upon her finger, now rose, and divesting herself of her out-of-door attire, began to lay the cloth for supper. "Ah, dear me, dear me, dear me," said Mrs. Tetterby. "That's the way the world goes." "Which is the way the world goes, my dear?" asked Mr. Tetterby, looking round. "Oh, nothing," said Mrs. Tetterby. Mr. Tetterby elevated his eyebrows, folded his newspaper afresh, and carried his eyes up it, and down it, and across it, but was wandering in his attention, and not reading it. Mrs. Tetterby, at the same time, laid the cloth, but rather as if she were punishing the table than preparing the family supper. hitting it unnecessarily hard with the knives and forks, slapping it with the plates, dinting it with the salt cellar, and coming heavily down upon it with the loaf. "Ah, dear me, dear me, dear me," said Mrs. Tetterby. "That's the way the world goes." "My duck," returned her husband, looking round again, "you said that before. Which is the way the world goes?" "Oh, nothing," said Mrs. Tetterby. "Sophia," remonstrated her husband, "you said that before too." "Well, I'll say it again if you like," returned Mrs. Tetterby. "Oh, nothing. There. And again if you like. Oh, nothing. There. And again if you like. Oh, nothing. Now then." Mr. Tetterby brought his eyes to bear upon the partner of his bosom, and said in mild astonishment, "My little woman, what puts you out?" "I'm sure I don't know," she retorted. "Don't ask me. Who said I was put out at all? I never did." Mr. Tetterby gave up the perusal of his newspaper as a bad job, and taking a slow walk across the room with his hands behind him and his shoulders raised, his gait according perfectly with the resignation of his manner, addressed himself to his two eldest offspring. "Your supper will be ready in a minute, Dolphus," said Mr. Tetterby. "Your mother has been out in the wet, to the cook's shop, to buy it. It was very good of your mother to do so. You shall get some supper too, very soon, Johnny. Your mother's pleased with you, my man, for being so attentive to your precious sister." Mrs. Tetterby, without any remark, but with a decided subsidence of her animosity towards the table, finished her preparations, and took from her ample basket a substantial slab of hot peas pudding wrapped in paper, and a basin covered with a saucer, which, on being uncovered, sent forth an odour so agreeable that the 3 pairs of eyes in the 2 beds opened wide and fixed themselves upon the banquet. Mr. Tetterby, without regarding this tacit invitation to be seated, stood repeating slowly, "Yes, yes, your supper will be ready in a minute, Dolphus. Your mother went out in the wet to the cook's shop to buy it. It was very good of your mother so to do," until Mrs. Tetterby, who had been exhibiting sundry tokens of contrition behind him, caught him round the neck and wept. "Oh, Dolphus," said Mrs. Tetterby, "how could I go and behave so?" This reconciliation affected Adolphus the younger and Johnny to that degree that they both, as with one accord, raised a dismal cry, which had the effect of immediately shutting up the round eyes in the beds, and utterly routing the 2 remaining little Tetterbies, just then stealing in from the adjoining closet to see what was going on in the eating way. "I am sure, Dolphus," sobbed Mrs. Tetterby, "coming home, I had no more idea than a child unborn." Mr. Tetterby seemed to dislike this figure of speech, and observed, "Say than the baby, my dear." "Had no more idea than the baby," said Mrs. Tetterby. "Johnny, don't look at me, but look at her, or she'll fall out of your lap and be killed, and then you'll die in agonies of a broken heart, and serve you right. No more idea I hadn't than that, darling, of being cross when I came home. But somehow, Dolphus—" Mrs. Tetterby paused, and again turned her wedding ring round and round upon her finger. "I see," said Mr. Tetterby. "I understand. My little woman was put out. Hard times and hard weather and hard work make it trying now and then. I see. Bless your soul, no wonder. Dolph, my man," continued Mr. Tetterby, exploring the basin with a fork, "here's your mother been and bought at the cook's shop, besides peas pudding, a whole knuckle of lovely roast leg of pork, with lots of crackling left upon it, and with seasoning, gravy, and mustard quite unlimited. Hand in your plate, my boy, and begin while it's simmering." Master Adolphus, needing no second summons, received his portion with eyes rendered moist by appetite, and withdrawing to his particular stool, fell upon his supper tooth and nail. Johnny was not forgotten, but received his rations on bread, lest he should in a flush of gravy trickle any on the baby. He was required for similar reasons to keep his pudding, when not on active service, in his pocket. There might have been more pork on the knuckle-bone, which knuckle-bone the carver at the cook's shop had assuredly not forgotten in carving for previous customers. But there was no stint of seasoning, and that is an accessory dreamily suggesting pork and pleasantly cheating the sense of taste. The peas pudding, too, the gravy and mustard, like the eastern rose in respect of the nightingale, if they were not absolutely pork, had lived near it. So, upon the whole, there was the flavour of a middle-sized pig. It was irresistible to the Tetterbies in bed, who, though professing to slumber peacefully, crawled out when unseen by their parents, and silently appealed to their brothers for any gastronomic token of fraternal affection. They, not hard of heart, presenting scraps in return. It resulted that a party of light skirmishers, in nightgowns, were careering about the parlour all through supper, which harassed Mr. Tetterby exceedingly, and once or twice imposed upon him the necessity of a charge, before which these guerrilla troops retired in all directions and in great confusion. Mrs. Tetterby did not enjoy her supper. There seemed to be something on Mrs. Tetterby's mind. At one time she laughed without reason, and at another time she cried without reason, and at last she laughed and cried together in a manner so very unreasonable that her husband was confounded. "My little woman," said Mr. Tetterby, "if the world goes that way, it appears to go the wrong way, and to choke you." "Give me a drop of water," said Mrs. Tetterby, struggling with herself. "And don't speak to me for the present, or take any notice of me. Don't do it." Mr. Tetterby, having administered the water, turned suddenly on the unlucky Johnny, who was full of sympathy, and demanded why he was wallowing there, in gluttony and idleness, instead of coming forward with the baby, that the sight of her might revive his mother. Johnny immediately approached, borne down by its weight, but Mrs. Tetterby, holding out her hand to signify that she was not in a condition to bear that trying appeal to her feelings, he was interdicted from advancing another inch, on pain of perpetual hatred from all his dearest connections, and accordingly retired to his stool again and crushed himself as before. Thank you for listening. This has been Charles Dickens, The Haunted Man and the Ghost's Bargain, Chapter 2, Part 1. I've been Jay. This has been a Web of Classic Tales. Please like, subscribe, share, comment. Click the bell icon for notifications. I hope you're having a fantastic day. Have a nice life, and I'll see you next time.